Look, here's where it all lands with Drake, YG, and the darkest allegation this culture has heard in a very long time. Because if what Glasses Malone just said out loud on that microphone is even a little bit true, then we are not talking about a rap beef anymore, we are not talking about a versus show that got cancelled, we are not even talking about Kendrick Lamar and the pop-out and the ghosts of that whole summer. We are talking about a straight-up allegation that Drake, the biggest pop rapper on the planet, has personally financed a campaign to put YG in a jail cell before he could ever set foot on that versus stage with the game. And if you think that sentence is a stretch, you are going to want to sit down for the next 30 minutes, because Glasses Malone did not whisper this, Glasses Malone did not hint at it, Glasses Malone did not dance around it. Glasses Malone looked into a camera, said the man's name, and accused Drake of paying money to weaponize the Drakeo Ruler investigation against YG. And check this, before we even get 1 inch deeper, run it up on that like button, run it up on that subscribe button, because the pretenders and the plants and the puppets running Drake's PR machine are already trying to bury this clip, they are already trying to shove it off timelines, and the only way this story survives the algorithm is if the real ones in this comment section make some noise. So run it up, drop a word in the comments, tell me if you buy Glasses Malone's story or if you think this is street theater, and let's get into the wildest allegation of the summer. Now here is the setup. YG was booked, YG was locked in, YG was 3 days away from a versus event with the game that could have been the biggest West Coast moment of the year. 2 coasts of Cali royalty, 1 stage, 1 night, 1 bag. And then, out of absolutely nowhere, the police move on YG. He gets detained. He gets pulled into questioning. And what is the topic? Not a traffic stop, not a random warrant, not some parking ticket nonsense. The topic is Drakeo the Ruler. The topic is a case that has been sitting open for nearly 5 years. The topic is the one investigation YG did not want anywhere near his name 3 days before the biggest show of his year. That is the timing. That is the coincidence. That is the thing that made everybody's eyebrow go up before Glasses Malone ever opened his mouth. And now Glasses Malone has opened his mouth, and what he said reframes the entire story. Here is the trick. Here is the setup. Glasses Malone claims that Drake is behind it. Not adjacent to it. Not benefiting from it. Behind it. Glasses Malone says on that podcast, in that clip, on that microphone, that Drake is spending real money to keep the Drakeo campaign alive, to keep YG's name inside of it, and to make sure the pressure on YG stays hot enough that a versus event with a Drake affiliate never actually happens. That is the accusation. That is the sentence that just hit the culture. And you can hear it in the clip yourself, because Glasses Malone was not even talking about YG when he said it. He was talking about Drake and the way Drake operates, and out of his own mouth he said that Drake is financing a Drakeo campaign to mess with YG's life because Drake is upset about a battle he was not even in. Say that back to yourself. Drake, upset about a battle he was not even in, allegedly funding pressure on the man who was supposed to be in it. That is where we are in the year 2026. That is the level this culture has climbed to. And if that is real, if any percentage of that is real, then everything else we thought we understood about the last 2 years of this rap ecosystem needs to be reread from the first page. And listen to this, because you cannot separate this allegation from the Kendrick Lamar of it all. YG was at the pop-out. YG stood on that stage. YG raised his hand in that room. And ever since that night, everybody who was on that stage, everybody who was in that circle, everybody who was tied to that moment has been watching their shadow. Some of them got quiet. Some of them lost deals. Some of them started catching random smoke from angles they never expected. And now the biggest name from that stage, the one with the most catalog, the one with the most industry weight left in his back pocket, gets pulled by the police 3 days before a show that would have put him right back on top of the West Coast conversation. You do not have to be a conspiracy person to see the shape of the picture. You just have to have functioning eyes. And Glasses Malone, sitting in his chair, said the quiet part out loud, and now the whole culture is stuck holding that sentence. Now let me be clear before we go one syllable further. We are keeping this alleged. Everything Glasses Malone said is an allegation. Drake has not been charged with anything. Drake has not been named in any court filing. Drake's team has not responded on record. And YG has not confirmed a single word of what Glasses Malone said in that podcast. So we are not sitting here declaring Drake guilty. We are sitting here saying that a well-connected, deeply respected West Coast voice looked into a camera and said Drake is paying money to mess with YG's freedom, and that sentence deserves the same forensic energy this culture gave to every single line of every single diss track in 2024. That is the standard. That is the bar. And that is the reason we have to keep going. Because check this. The clip itself is not soft. Glasses Malone is not being coy. When his co-host tries to redirect the conversation, Glasses Malone doubles down. He says he does not think the man understands. He says he is not like the rest of them. He says Drake is not built the way the streets are built. He says Drake has rented power, not real power. He says when real power moves for you, it moves for you because it is real, not because you paid for it. And then he says, and this is the sentence that broke the internet, he says Drake is a mark, and Drake is spending money on a Drakeo campaign to mess with YG's life and get him arrested because Drake is mad about a battle. Read that sentence again. Read it slower. Because that is not a diss line. That is not a bar. That is a man on a podcast, on the record, making a serious accusation about the biggest rapper on the planet, and doing it with zero hesitation and zero smile. And here is where the operation and the setup start to look like more than a rumor. Because when you line up the dominoes, they do not fall in random directions. They fall in one direction. YG has a versus scheduled with The Game. The Game is a documented Drake affiliate. The versus would have been a massive moment for both artists. And right before the versus, YG gets detained on a Drakeo warrant. Not a new case. Not a new charge. A 5-year-old investigation that suddenly finds new legs at the exact worst possible moment for YG's calendar. That is not weather. That is not luck. That is not these things happen. That is a pattern. And Glasses Malone is saying he knows the shape of the pattern because he has watched it get built. Now let's talk about what actually happened with YG and the search warrant, because this part is public record and it is important context for the allegation. On July 23, 2026, YG was detained during a search warrant that authorities have publicly connected to the Drakeo the Ruler investigation. He was later released. No charges were filed. But the reporting was everywhere. Every blog, every timeline, every hip-hop platform ran the story within hours. And the timing, again, was 3 days before a scheduled versus event with The Game. That is the reporting. That is the record. And that is the reporting Glasses Malone is looking at when he sits down on that podcast and says the sentence he said. He is not making up a scenario in his head. He is looking at a real, documented, publicly reported detention, and he is telling the culture that he believes it was engineered. And the reason he believes it was engineered brings us to the deposition, because you cannot understand this story without understanding the Al Cooper deposition. Al Cooper III was working security for Drakeo the Ruler on the night of the December 2021 incident at the festival where Drakeo lost his life. In March of 2025, Al Cooper sat for a deposition. In that deposition, Al Cooper said, under oath, that he saw YG at the front of the confrontation. Al Cooper said he recognized YG by his eyes and his build even though YG was wearing a ski mask. Al Cooper said YG produced what looked like a short blade, and that 2 men flanking him also had similar blades. Al Cooper's deposition surfaced publicly in July of 2026, right around the same window as the YG detention. And that is the piece of paper the whole Drakeo campaign has been building on for the last few weeks. That deposition is the fuel. That deposition is the accelerant. And Glasses Malone is saying somebody is pouring gasoline on it on purpose. Now the story deepens, because YG did not stay silent about any of it. YG made a song. YG made a whole record about the accusations against him. That record is called We Know the Truth, and if you have not heard it, you need to press play tonight, because YG lays out his entire defense line by line, verse by verse, receipt by receipt. YG opens the song by pointing out that if he had done what people are saying, then the fact that he is not in a jail cell would make him a rat, and he is not a rat, and he is not in a jail cell, and neither of those things is a coincidence. YG points out that he was getting paid $600,000 to perform at that festival, and no rational human being torches a $600,000 bag by starting violence at the venue. YG says he pulled up to work, heard the same chaos the crowd heard, and found out with everyone else that someone had been hit with a blade. YG says he never named anybody, but somehow his name ended up in every conversation. And on the second verse, YG makes the argument that this beef was never even a two-sided beef in the first place. YG says he never asked to be in the middle of any of it. YG says the whole thing was one-sided from jump. YG says the man who was beefing with a completely different rapper, and that story is a whole other chapter for another day. YG points at what he calls the acting, the theatrics, the character work, and he says if that is the level of performance, then somebody should have gotten cast in a movie instead of trying to drag him into a case. That is the argument. That is the defense. And it is not a soft defense. It is direct, it is documented, and it is set to a beat that is honestly one of the sharpest West Coast records of the summer. But the third verse is where YG lands the punch, because YG says he never talked about the case before because that is the law. And notice the double meaning there. The law of the streets says you do not speak on other people's cases. The law of the actual court system says you do not add fuel to an open investigation with your own words. Either way, YG is saying he has been silent on purpose. He is saying he has been eating criticism for years because opening his mouth would have made things worse for himself and for everybody around him. He is saying he watched the narrative build. He is saying he watched the story get told about him. He is saying he let it happen because that was the smart move. And now, only now, with the deposition public and the detention on record, YG is speaking. And what he is saying is that the whole story people think they know is not the story that actually happened. Now stack the two pieces of evidence next to each other. On one side, you have Glasses Malone saying Drake is financing a Drakeo campaign to pressure YG. On the other side, you have YG dropping a song called We Know the Truth in which he directly addresses a coordinated public narrative that he says has been built against him. What are the odds that those two artists, in the same season, on the same coast, in the same news cycle, are describing the exact same operation from two different angles? That is not a coincidence. That is a chorus. And the chorus is telling the culture that somebody with a checkbook has been paying to shape the story of Drakeo the Ruler's case in a very specific direction. That is what Glasses Malone is alleging. That is what YG is implying in his own record. And that is the sentence hip-hop is going to have to sit with for the rest of the year. And here is where the game gets even more complicated, because you cannot leave the game out of this equation. The Versus event that got cancelled was supposed to be YG versus the game. The game has documented history with Drake. The game has been a Drake affiliate for years. The game was also, if you rewind the timeline, part of that original Once Upon a Time in LA lineup back in 2021. Once Upon a Time in LA was the festival. The festival was the night. The night was the incident that took Drakeo the Ruler's life. So the game is not a stranger to this story either. The game is inside the story from multiple angles. And the game is the exact man YG was scheduled to share a stage with before the police showed up. That is not a small detail. That is a huge detail. And it deserves to be looked at with the same seriousness we are giving to the Glasses Malone clip. Because think about this. If Glasses Malone is right, if there is really a Drakeo campaign being financed with Drake money, then the timing of the YG detention right before a versus with a Drake affiliate is not an accident. It is a signal. It is a move on the board. It is somebody making sure the West Coast moment does not happen. And it is somebody making sure YG walks into that versus, if he walks into it at all, with a headline hanging over his head that has nothing to do with the music. That is the operation Glasses Malone is describing. That is the setup he is putting on the record. And whether you believe him or not, you have to admit the pieces line up cleaner than they should. Now let me pump the brakes for 1 second, because we owe the audience the other side of the ledger. There is a version of this story where none of it is engineered. There is a version where the Al Cooper deposition surfaced on its own timeline because the civil case was moving. There is a version where the search warrant was executed because investigators genuinely believed they had probable cause based on the deposition, not because a rapper paid for it to happen. There is a version where Glasses Malone is drawing a line between dots that do not actually connect. That is a possibility. That is a real possibility. And any honest coverage of this story has to leave that door open, because assuming a conspiracy on the word of one podcast clip is exactly the kind of thing that turns real reporting into a rumor mill. We are not doing that here. We are keeping the door open on both sides. But here is the problem, because even when you keep the door open on both sides, you still have to explain why the timing is what it is. You still have to explain why a 5-year-old case suddenly got public traction 3 days before a versus with a Drake affiliate. You still have to explain why Glasses Malone, a West Coast veteran with no obvious reason to fabricate, would risk his own name to put that allegation on the record. You still have to explain why YG dropped a whole song, in the same window, addressing what he calls a coordinated narrative against him. You cannot dismiss all of those data points at the same time. At some point the coincidence math stops working. And that is the corner Glasses Malone is putting Drake into with this clip. Now let's talk about the mechanism, because this is the part that actually matters if the allegation is true. How would something like this even work? Glasses Malone says Drake is paying to run the campaign. But paying who? Paying for what? And this is the part where the culture is going to argue with itself for weeks. One theory is that Drake, or people connected to Drake, are paying certain platforms and certain personalities to keep the Drakeo angle warm, to keep YG's name attached to it, and to keep the pressure on public opinion. That is one lane. Another theory is that money is going even further downstream, to people willing to talk, to people willing to file, to people willing to keep the case in front of investigators. That is a heavier lane, and Glasses Malone did not spell out which lane he was talking about. He just said the money is moving. And he said the money is moving on purpose. And this is where the audience has to be honest about how the modern music industry actually works. Narratives are bought. Narratives are placed. Narratives are seeded and watered and pruned like plants in a greenhouse. This is not a wild claim. This has been the reporting for years across multiple genres, and it is not unique to hip-hop. What Glasses Malone is alleging is not that Drake invented a new form of manipulation. What Glasses Malone is alleging is that Drake is using a form of manipulation that already exists, and pointing it at YG for personal reasons. And the personal reasons are the last piece of the puzzle. Because Glasses Malone is saying Drake is doing this because of the battle. Not the beef with Kendrick. The battle. The pop-out. The room that YG was standing in that Drake was not standing in. That is the wound Glasses Malone is describing. And in his telling, Drake is still bleeding from it 2 years later. And here is the meta point that this culture has to reckon with. If a wound from a battle can turn into a whispered campaign against somebody's freedom, then rap is not what rap used to be. Rap used to end on the microphone. You lost a battle, you took the L, you plotted the response, and you came back with music. That was the exchange. That was the deal. That was the contract between competitors. What Glasses Malone is describing is a violation of that contract. He is describing a world where a losing artist reaches outside of music, outside of the studio, outside of the sport, and tries to hurt the other side in the real world. And if that is real, if any layer of that is real, then it is not just Drake's reputation on the line. It is the whole ethic of competitive hip-hop. That is why this clip landed the way it landed. That is why every commentator in the culture is running it. That is why every timeline is stuck on it. Because it is not a diss line. It is not a beef bar. It is a structural accusation. And structural accusations move slower and hit harder than any single record ever could. YG's record hits. Kendrick's records hit. But Glasses Malone's sentence, if it holds up, would rearrange the entire way this culture reads the last 3 years of Drake's career. It would put a different filter over every move, every song, every strategic PR play, every carefully placed interview. It would ask the audience to reread everything with fresh eyes. Now I want to zoom in on one more piece of the puzzle, because Glasses Malone dropped a phrase in that clip that a lot of people scrolled past. He said the man has rent power, not real power. And that is the sentence I keep coming back to. Because when Glasses Malone says rent power, he is describing exactly the kind of arrangement he is alleging. He is saying the power Drake is using is not the power that comes from the street. It is not the power that comes from real credibility. It is the power that comes from a checkbook. It is transactional. It is temporary. It is loud while it is being paid for, and it goes quiet the second the payment stops. That is a very specific accusation. That is a very specific worldview. And that is Glasses Malone saying, in code that the streets understand instantly, that the Drakeo campaign has a receipt, and the receipt has a signature on it, and the signature is what he is trying to get people to notice. And in that framing, YG's song title suddenly reads different. We know the truth. Read it out loud. We know the truth. It is not YG saying he knows the truth. It is YG saying the audience knows the truth. It is YG saying the people the campaign has been aimed at know the truth. It is YG saying, in his own coded way, that the Operation Glasses Malone just described is not news to him, is not news to his camp, is not news to the West Coast. He is saying, we have been watching this build. We have been eating the accusations. We have been letting the narrative run. And now we are done being quiet about it. That is the reframe. That is the double meaning. And once you hear it that way, you cannot unhear it. Now let me put the question directly to the audience, because this is the moment the comments section decides where the culture stands. Do you believe Glasses Malone? Do you believe that Drake, in 2026, is financing a campaign to keep YG tangled in the Drakeo case? Do you believe that a battle Drake was not even in is the reason a versus with the game got detonated 3 days before showtime? Or do you think Glasses Malone is stretching, misreading, or venting? Because there is no wrong answer here. There is only the answer the culture arrives at together. And the culture only arrives at an answer when the comments move. So move the comments. Say the thing. Take the position. And tell me exactly where you land, because I am reading every one of them and I am pinning the sharpest takes. Now the second question, and this one is bigger, is what happens to Drake if this allegation gets even one piece of confirmation. Because we are not in the era where a rapper can survive a structural accusation just by dropping a new record. We are past that. Drake tried that. Drake dropped an entire album full of it. And the audience is still asking the same questions the audience was asking before the album ever came out. So the album did not close the loop. The album opened new loops. And now Glasses Malone has opened a loop that no album can close, because you cannot rap your way out of a paid campaign allegation. You can only wait for the receipts to arrive, or you can wait for the culture to move on. And this culture is not moving on. This culture is locked in. Now here is the third question, and this one is for the deepest heads in the room. What does this mean for the versus format? Because versus was supposed to be a celebration. Versus was supposed to be legacy meeting legacy on a live stage. And versus is now becoming a target. If a versus can be dismantled 3 days before showtime by a 5-year-old case getting new legs at exactly the wrong moment, then no versus is safe. Then every artist with a complicated past is going to look at the format and ask if it is worth the risk. Then the format itself starts to shrink. And that would be a loss for the culture that has nothing to do with Drake or YG or Kendrick or the game or Drakeo the Ruler. That would be a loss for everybody who wants to see two legends on one stage the way this culture is supposed to celebrate. Now I want to bring the story back to Drakeo for a second, because Drakeo the Ruler deserves the honor of being remembered inside of this story, not just as a case number. Drakeo was one of the most stylistically original artists the West Coast produced in the last decade. Drakeo built an entire subgenre out of his own cadence. Drakeo influenced records you have heard on the radio without knowing his fingerprint was on them. Drakeo lost his life at that festival on December 18, 2021, and the case remains open to this day. The people who love Drakeo have been waiting almost 5 years for answers. And every single conversation about this case has to keep that fact at the center. Whether Glasses Malone is right about Drake, whether YG is right in his defense, whether the deposition holds up, whether the search warrant leads to charges, none of it means anything if the family and the fanbase of Drakeo do not eventually get the truth. That is the North Star. That is the reason any of us are still talking about any of this. And that is why the Glasses Malone allegation cuts as deep as it cuts. Because if it is true, if somebody is financing a campaign around a case that has real human stakes and using it as a weapon in a rap feud, then that is a level of disrespect to Drakeo's memory that the culture cannot absorb quietly. That is not a music industry story anymore. That is a moral story. That is a legacy story. That is a story about whether the biggest names in this genre still respect the artists this genre lost. Glasses Malone knows that. Glasses Malone said what he said with the weight of that context on his shoulders. And that is why the clip landed the way it landed, and that is why every serious voice in the culture is having to weigh in on it. Now let me tie the whole thread together before we get to the close, because a lot has been laid down and it deserves to be summarized clean. Glasses Malone alleges that Drake is financing a Drakeo campaign to pressure YG. YG was detained on a Drakeo warrant 3 days before a versus with a Drake affiliate. The Al Cooper deposition, which places YG at the front of the December 2021 confrontation, surfaced publicly in the same window. YG has denied every allegation, including under oath in his own way through a full record called We Know the Truth. The game, YG's scheduled versus opponent, has both Drake ties and Once Upon a Time in LA ties. Kendrick Lamar's Pop Out is the unnamed third rail of this entire ecosystem. And Drake has not responded to any of it on record. Those are the facts as they sit tonight. And those are the facts every serious observer of this culture is going to be turning over in their head for the next several weeks. Now for the honest part. We do not know how this ends. We do not know if Glasses Malone has more receipts he has not shown yet. We do not know if there is a paper trail that will ever surface. We do not know if the search warrant will lead to any actual charges against YG. We do not know if Drake will respond, deny, sue, or ignore. We do not know if the versus with the game will ever be rescheduled. We do not know if YG's record will do what he wants it to do, which is close the chapter on a narrative he says has been built against him. We are sitting in the middle of an open story. And open stories are the ones that shape a culture the most, because they force the audience to pick a lane in real time. So pick a lane. Tell me the lane. Drop the lane in the comments. And do not soft pedal it. Because the era of soft pedaling every big accusation is over. This culture is a full contact culture, and the audience is old enough and smart enough now to read a story like this and take a position without waiting for a press release. If you think Glasses Malone is telling the truth, say it. If you think Glasses Malone is stretching, say that. If you think YG is guilty of what the deposition claims, say that too. If you think YG is being framed, say it loud. And if you think Drake is the mastermind Glasses Malone is describing him as, or if you think Drake is being scapegoated for a case that has nothing to do with him, put it on the record. And here is where I have to be very careful, because I want to leave you with one thought that stays with you after this video ends. The thought is this. Whatever the truth turns out to be, the fact that this allegation is even on the table right now says something about the state of rap in 2026. It says the game has grown so big, the money has grown so heavy, and the stakes have grown so tall that a losing side of a battle can allegedly be accused of buying a case against a bystander. That is where we are. That is the culture we are protecting. That is the culture we are voting for every time we click a link, watch a clip, share a post, or pop off in a comment section. And the only way this culture ever gets healthy again is if the audience holds every side accountable in real time. The artists. The commentators. The platforms. The podcasters. The lawyers. The label executives. Everybody. Because when nobody is held accountable, everybody starts to feel like a mark. That is Glasses Malone's word, not mine. Mark. Read it again. That is what he called Drake. And that is a word with a very specific meaning in West Coast street language. A mark is a target. A mark is a fool. A mark is someone who thinks he is running the game while the game is running him. And Glasses Malone is saying, on the record, in a clip that is now permanent on the internet, that the biggest rapper in the world is a mark. That sentence alone would have been the story of the summer. The Drakeo campaign accusation just amplifies it. Put them together, and you have one of the sharpest, most damaging statements a peer artist has made about Drake in the last 5 years. And it came from a man who has no reason to lie and no incentive to burn a bridge unless he is standing on something. So here is what happens next. Glasses Malone is going to be asked to say more. Drake is going to be asked to respond. YG is going to keep dropping music. The game is going to have to explain where he stands with the verses that fell apart. And the audience, meaning you, meaning the people watching this video right now, is going to decide which version of the story sticks. Because the version that sticks becomes the version that wins. And the version that wins becomes the truth that this culture carries into the next chapter. That is how narratives work. That is how history gets written. And that is why the comments section under this video actually matters more than the podcast clip itself. Because Glasses Malone made the statement. The audience makes the verdict. Now before I get out of here, let me leave you with the sentence I keep coming back to. Glasses Malone said Drake is spending money on a Drakeo campaign to mess with YG's life because he is mad about a battle. Read it slow. Sit with it. Turn it over. Because if that sentence turns out to be true, even partially true, even one layer of it true, then the curtain is coming down on the version of Drake this culture has been asked to accept for the last 5 years. And no album, no lawsuit, no PR play, and no Billboard rollout is going to be able to put that curtain back up.